Thank you so much for coming here. We know what an incredible busy time of year this is for all of our students, but we're so delighted to have you here to welcome our special guest, Virgil Abloh. We're just thrilled that you're here, Virgil. And through your many accomplishments, awards, and associations, you are a stellar example of something we talk a lot about at RISD, the importance of transcending categories. In fact, we like to think that boundaries are meant to be guidelines rather than walls. A lot of talk about walls right now. We think about them differently. We use guidelines to draw from the rich histories of the past without remaining mired there. Every advancing ideology draws from the past, but always looks ahead. Contemporary cultural leaders create new categories, transcend expected precincts, redefine past identity constructs, question the frames of disciplines, classifications, and precedents. Virgil Abloh is someone who reroutes our thinking about contemporary creative practice. At root and by training, he is an architect and engineer, receiving a master's in architecture from Illinois Institute of Technology and an undergraduate civil engineering degree from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. His education provided a strong launching platform for latitude later. You likely know Virgil as a successful DJ, fashion designer, creator of the elevated street brand OffWhite, or as a creative director for icons like Kanye West. Virgil was living in Chicago as Kanye was rising in fame. They started working together in 2003 on the day of Virgil's graduation. He actually skipped most of his final critique to take a meeting with Kanye's manager at the time, John Monopoly. Now, I'm not advocating that. That worked for Virgil, but I want to be very clear that you need to go to your final critiques. Most recently, you might think of Virgil as a furniture designer, something that obviously strikes a chord for me personally. Virgil and I first met through a panel that I moderated at Design Miami this past December, January. Through our preparatory conversations, I quickly became a fan, enthused by how Virgil positioned himself within his creative practice, exemplifying success through his own versatility, but still bringing independent rigor to each aspect of that practice. Virgil moves fluidly across mediums in the same way that he moves across time zones, traveling frequently from Italy, where his label OffWhite resides, to Hong Kong, Tokyo, LA, New York, and his hometown, Chicago. This fluidity across time, space, and mediums is grounded by Virgil's own deeply thoughtful, personal, and decisive sense of style, self, and mission. In a recent talk at Columbia, which he titled, "Young Architects Can Change the World by Not Building Buildings," Virgil made his mission very clear. Ours is the first generation, he said, where we can unveil the mask, give the kids the tools, let them create, and we'll have a better existence afterwards. Everything I make is to validate this one concept. Virgil, I can assure you that there are many students here tonight who join you in this spirit and who we believe will help to make our own existences better. I am certain that they, along with the rest of us, are very glad that you're here. So please welcome Virgil Abloh.
Crazy. What up? Hold on 2 seconds. I gotta get something from behind you. It's gonna be fine. I'm back. So, you hear these stories all the time of like a creative or someone that you look up to and like how their story started and like the stumbling blocks or like little hurdles that were in the earlier part of their career. And the ironic thing about me standing here talking to you guys is that you guys have already beat me on one clear principle, is that you got accepted into RISD because I did not. Which is cool, no hard feelings. But I really did want to come here because from the point that I was as a young sort of kid with ambition, I just knew that I wanted to create. And I knew that I needed a place to learn how to do that. And what I love about higher education and the importance of it to like this younger generation of all of us collectively is this is like a safe haven to sort of foster and learn skill sets that'll be with you for the rest of your life. So with that, of course, like given the opportunity to speak here, I was like gladly honored, and even more so just to be on campus to kind of see what I might have missed out on. And so my brain only works one way, which is to like work an insane amount. So I got up here this afternoon and I was like, what's this talk gonna be about? Like, I'm very always like almost self-conscious in a way of like being in front of a group of people talking about creative stuff, because just by nature of it, it can be like, hey, look at all my past projects, like, aren't they cool? Like, that's whack to me. You know, I'm not really interested in my own work in that way. I'm more interested in sort of showcasing how my work can inspire you guys to sort of like reach its highest potential. So the topic of this discussion was made up as soon as I got to campus. Like I finally realized what it was. And I Instagrammed it this morning. I said, yeah, I just want to find the bookstore and get a shirt with the logo on it, because I love the logo. You guys have like top 5 logos of anything. It's like better than every streetwear brand off top. So good, timing. So I get to campus, like go to the bookstore, I was like, oh, this is like perfect colorways of everything. Get a red, blue one, and then I was like, oh, this is what the talk is gonna be about. I'm gonna buy these sweatshirts and try to make something, you know, like use the 4 hours that I have on campus to sort of like do what you guys do, you know, like throw me in the ring of fire and like see what you can come up with. And of course, I like perpetually multitasking, had like interviews to do and I was already late, but still managed to find room 216. I guess there's like a printer, like textile printer in there. Shout out to that department for letting me slide. And then of course, it was so funny, I get there, you know, like have no artwork, nothing. And I'm like, I need a printer to print on something, still thinking of what I would make. And they're like, oh, you can just use that computer. I was like, perfect, like assuming it would be like an Apple type thing with a font like Helvetica on it, and it was not. It was like PC with like Comic Sans or like something, but whatever, we managed, as I'll show you in a second. But you know, what I love about this process already is like, these are your tools that you guys have, and you know, it doesn't matter what I've done, like using the same skill set of just thinking and sort of ingenuity or finessing to like get to a place to make something. And then, of course, got that far. I had a couple of interviews to do, and then I was like, I need to sew this thing together. You know, I don't even know what like the alteration to this hoodie or crew neck was going to be, but I just know I wanted to do something with that. So then, of course, like running against the clock, I'm looking at it's like 5 o'clock, and it's like the talk is at 6. I was like, the idea is too good to not like finish all the way through. So we go to the apparel design building. It sucks that I don't know any of these people that helped me out's name. It was all too fast, but I'm gonna find them out and shout them out in some way. But this like super eager girl comes walking out to come to see the talk, and she opens the door, and I was like, hey, I need you. You have to come back and help me sew this idea together that I still don't have in my head exactly yet. And then we just kind of like started the Instagram live video, and with all the kids that were sitting in the sophomore apparel design sort of lab, sort of like helped me put this idea together, which of course, you know, it's 4 hours, but I'm really proud of it, and it's probably gonna be in the next like OffWhite collection for sure. But you can kind of see it's just a deconstructed sort of vibe where we just like cut up the middle, but like shout out to room 206 to like help me print this like RISD design. And I was like, oh, let's put the exact date that we should put this in the museum archive. Like, you should challenge every designer who comes and speaks to like go through the gauntlet and try to like do something. And then, like, typical to my sort of thought process of like working yourself to like a maximum is that's where you get the good ideas and the challenge. Like halfway through the day, I was just like, that was a good idea, but I'm not going to be able to execute it. So like, I'll just give up on it. I never say that to myself. And while I was sitting halfway through an interview, I was like, we just got to do it. There's no failure, you know? So that's something that I would like preach and take as a takeaway for all you guys in this point in your career is that perfectionism doesn't advance anything, ironically. As a creative and as a designer, there's no wrong way to go about the future of your career. The only failure is not to try, you know, and I think that designers, we all have like or creators or artists, we have a natural convention to sort of be maybe tormented or a little bit of like an inner struggle. Is the work living up to its fullest potential, or is it, you know, is it as great as the work that you idolize from your design idols? But at the end of the day, it's your body of work, and it's the amount of work and the refinement of that work that'll define who you are as a creative. So, you know, just by this challenge of like not being fearful of perfectionism, of being able to do it, then I resulted in not just one idea that I wanted, but two. So I'm sitting here, I'm looking like at the resources that you guys have. You know, this is the beginnings of like an idea that I'm really excited about, but this transparency layer that has the same branding that I love, that keeps reappearing, that's yours. But the idea is like, this is just a garment bag that was sitting up against a wall, and I was like, my original idea was to try to make like a raincoat really fast. And I was just asking these sophomores, I was like, okay, I got the idea, can you guys make the sleeves? It was like, mind you, there was like 7 minutes left of this whole thing. But, you know, what I love about showing you guys is like, A, this was made in collaborations with students that were just like sitting in a classroom, but B, it's the way that the world works, you know, and these are things that you don't learn in school that I didn't know until, you know, where I'm at, like 15 years of like a young design career, is that collaboration is sort of the essence at which good work comes about. You know, as designers and artists, you always like look at the credit and you kind of only see like one person's name, but it's about the interconnectedness amongst yourselves that'll actually bring out new forms of work that'll like propel your career even further. So that's the sort of just microcosm of the day. You know, I'm proud because that was a way to sort of like understand the pace that which RISD moves and the pace that which like, you know, contemporary design culture in America, and it's super promising. So of course, the title of this talk is Theoretically Speaking, you know. And what I wanted to do is sort of talk about sort of one sort of organizing structure that I think is valuable. Something that I've learned is that when I started out, and I still am, I was always designing a thing, you know, providing a solution to whatever it was, whether it's a piece of furniture, whether it was an album cover, whether it was a stage design or a t-shirt or a brand. And then because I was doing that in succession, I sort of got into this nuance of not designing the thing anymore, but designing a presiding construct, you know, a thought process. And then the things start to design themselves. And I think that there's a through line in some of the things that I've made that sort of like highlight that. And, it's like the ready-made principle of art, right? Like taking things that exist and then putting them in a different context. So the diagonal lines of OffWhite, for example. Universal language, it's everywhere already. It's almost like unbrandable. It's like you can't take ownership of something that's universal, but in a way you can. And that's what I've used as sort of my presiding sort of pattern. But the evolution, the 2.0 of that is my new affinity for obviously Helvetica, but also the quotes. It's like doing Photoshop on your phone and an Instagram comment. Like I was just like scrolling through like, the emojis or whatever, just to sort of like find a voice to brand something that's readily available. So it's like almost to an annoying effect, using quotes to sort of like self-reference something or continue to define something by making you look twice at the word and look at it sort of like opposite in a way. So let's see here. I got a clicker with a couple slides to go through. And the idea with this talk is I'm interested in the dialogue. So I'm just presenting a few things, and then it's going to be opened up for a few questions and concepts about how I think about design. But yeah, it's the keyboard nomenclature. Basically, part of OffWhite is a thought process, right? It's like on paper, it could be seen as like a clothing brand or a fashion label. But when I look at it myself, it's a playground so that the world can sort of understand what ideas I have. 90% of them fall into like a clothing thing, but some spill off into a music thing, some spill off into a Travis Scott merch shirt, or something. But I needed a bucket, and I urge you guys all as well to like not only think about your work, but think about it in a context larger than that, and like what it means. I was super inspired by, designers like Margiela, and like when you say Margiela, of course, it's a whole thought process that equaled into clothing. And to me, that's something to strive for in young design and young artistic expressions. So, to me, a phrase can be as powerful as a garment. And so when I use these things that I've found with the keyboard and branding certain words, those become icons to me. Another sort of like bullet point of the sort of OffWhite design language for me is it's again on the non-perfectionist sort of angle, but it's leaving the end user space to input something into a design. So I call that leaving it undone. What's perfect is there's this podium here that's in front of these shoes that I'm wearing that are like a super fun project that I'm not supposed to speak about. But if you see me walking around, you can look at them up close. But essentially, what the design feature that is presiding is that they're basically half-finished shoes that are like existing in the real world and have been produced. And to me, that's like a quintessential like bullet point on the OffWhite design philosophy of the freedom that we're at. And I've been studying, or all those familiar with sort of like postmodern architecture, I believe that, it is almost the best time for design, art, and culture because it's sort of the most democratic it has ever been. We all have iPhones, which, it's an iconic design and thought process. We have a larger understanding of what fashion and art means to popular culture, to high society, and to Zara, H&M. So us as designers, it's now the time for us to sort of input the most pure form of our ideas into this ecosystem of culture to see new things come about. But yeah, a part of my design philosophy is the refreshing feeling of seeing something that largely is not given to the public, which is the process of being in the studio and seeing how things get created. So what I did is I just shift that, and I do that, like when we finish this, who knows, it might be as unfinished as that, because it gonna have a different emotion in your closet next to every other sweatshirt that is like perfectly finished. I also have like, and I urge all students to, like pick your mentors and understand what makes their work tick. So this is a quote by Rem Koolhaas, which basically, said, you can read it, but it's impossible to live in this age if you don't have a sense of many contradictory forces. That is the sort of concept behind OffWhite. It's neither black nor white, and it's not gray either. It's my medium in between those extremes, but also with my own aesthetic. So when we get into the question portion, I want some students to sort of speak about what is their presiding sort of guidance over their decisions on the creativity. Like, how do you decide if a piece is done? And the answer should be influenced by, like, if you look at like your last 30 outputs, like post-rationalize, because I'm interested. This is something I've like self-taught myself. I wish someone would have told me, like, start thinking of your work in this way, because now that I have these sort of the DNA of what strikes me as a creative, now I feel like I just graduated yesterday, and because now I kind of have a different understanding of what I'm doing, which is a funny thing. It's like I'm giving a talk and I'm basically talking about how I just figured out what I'm doing yesterday. So, but that's the OffWhite way. One project that I wanted to show to sort of like illustrate this point, because I like the idea of anyone who came here was like, what does that kid even do? Doesn't he just DJ for Travis Scott? Like, does he even make anything? And it's largely the work that I do that, doesn't have as much of like a home on Instagram or on home on Hypebeast, because I don't think it like translates the same as a pair of shoes or something. But the Miami Art Basel, I showcased sort of a living room. And of course, like, it's provocative on a specific level where it's what I see when I see a living room, or like a living room that doesn't necessarily exist, but it takes like a certain amount of imagination to sort of like finish off. And this is the whole like leaving things undone. It also weaves in obviously the whole ready-made aspect, but it makes you question, like, that's a table, but and people are like, oh, when am I going to put like a glass of water on it? How does that work? Or X, Y, Z, but it's technically it's a table. Those are chairs. Those the lighting, and the sort of graphic on the back is what I call a painting. So it's a Trivision sign that's embedded in the wall. It can hold like 3 messages, but sort of, robotically changes. This was made right after the election, and it's called a Blue State chair. It's just a cube of foam, but, through using my keyboard and using my sort of variance on reality of naming and marking things, this is a proposition, and again, that painting sort of moves. So it goes from the graphic, and it has phrases, as you can see, as well. So it's like these different instances that sort of give a sort of like variance on what's realistic. But coming from where I come from as like as a creative person, I like, and I challenge as well, students to sort of work in a genre-less sort of space. If you're in the illustration department doesn't mean that you shouldn't have ideas in apparel or film, and there's basically no boundaries in the real world. You can catch a check from like 17 different creative industries, so you guys are about to be rich. If you work hard, I think the amount of freedom that you guys will interface in this new world, I feel that creativity is like highly valued in all different industries. So, you know, keeping your eyes open to those things. As I wrap up, I think I'm interested to sort of like hear what's the contemporary train of thought amongst you guys as students at what you're seeing being output into the world. You know, I think there could be an interesting dialogue about that. But in spirit of keeping my sort of presentation brief so that we can sort of get into a cool dialogue, we can put a pause on that here.
Hello?
Yeah.
It's on. Okay, right?
Yeah,
Is that on?
yeah.
So how did it feel to be a RISD student today?
I love it.
How did it feel for the RISD students who all of a sudden were collaborating with Virgil today? Good. So I want to go back a little bit to talk about, you know, kind of pull you up from when you were a student, because I think a lot of students here are really interested in sort of the path and the journey. And a lot of what you said is so consistent with this notion of transcending time zones, transcending media, transcending finished or not finished. There was a great story. I did actually a seminar with some students about how do you know when a work of art is done. And there's a great story about the painter Bonnard, who used to go in, before there was security the way there is in museums now, who used to go, he would send his assistant with brushes and paints under a jacket and go back into the Louvre and, you know, touch up paintings because he didn't think they were quite right.
Wow.
And so there is this really interesting question with artists around what is done, what is, you know, good enough, what is perfect, all the kind of things you're raising, and I'll be eager to get into some of that later. But I know that in your very early work, you were influenced by Gropius. You were studying in a campus that was designed by Mies van der Rohe, which maybe had some influence on your use of the grid.
Yeah.
And you also were influenced by Caravaggio, and you mentioned Rem Koolhaas and also Margiela. Can you talk a little bit about how those influences actually affect the way that you work, which is so specifically Virgil Abloh? And so who are your heroes, and how do you take what you learned from them and then transfer it into something that's uniquely your own?
Yeah. And it's funny when, like, post-rationalizing my career and my taste, like, why do I like Helvetica? Why do I like graphics that look like that? Or why do I like fashion that feels like that? The first phase in becoming a designer is sort of like self-analyzing yourself. You know, it's sort of digging into, like, what are your primal emotions and why do you like the things that you like? And I think once you resolve that, there's also interjecting that with, you know, a premise that largely doesn't get talked about a lot in my thought process in design, is that we all have mentors. Like, no one invented anything. And I think that's where an artist or designer torment can come in, if you're constantly preoccupied with pretending like you're not influenced and pretending that you've synthesized something that never existed without any points of reference. Then that becomes a more dangerous sort of space as you try to, like, get to your core to go forward. So for me, I have just those clear influences, but the power of this room and us that can have the luxury to look back is that we can offer a 2.0 to every idea that was, you know, if we thought of creativity like tech, it's like, without the iPod 1, would we have gotten to the iPhone 7? and it's like we're iterating and building upon those things. So largely what I then do is I take things from different fields and then plug them into culture, which it's sort of like, how do we take the things that we're learning in school, like Caravaggio, Gropius, Mies van der Rohe, but then put something out into the world that helps them understand design without it being highbrow or too over their head. And you can do that. That's what's exciting to me, is that I can make things that educate other people in different zones by having a wide and varied source of inspiration, which is you named them, like those levels of influence on my work.
Yeah, thank you. So when you're doing this kind of research and thinking about the 2.0 or the kind of re-expression of something in a new way that's yours, and I'm secretly looking at the sneakers.
No one can look at these. Hype beast, chill.
Didn't I see those weren't those in the Met Gala last night?
Yeah.
Anyway, how do you...
Forever underdressed.
So when you're sort of taking this 2.0 into a new arena and making these bridges, crossing into these sort of new ways of connecting ideas, how do you build credibility to get the opportunity to do something before you're good at it?
Yeah, that's the trick. Like, because I do that to myself, where, it's like, I'm from Chicago. I didn't go to like a fashion school or particularly like a design school to sort of feel where the shallow end is on, like, is this credible or not? So I wrestled with that. Like, are these ideas that resonate in the public that we were doing, making these graphic T-shirts, is that fashion? I know that it's not traditional. And so what I've come to realize is that the modern world is us to define. The definition of credibility will change inherently as our generation adds 10 years onto itself. And I think that's super important in a way where it's just understanding that this idea of offering an update to classic things it's postmodern,
Postmodern.
Exactly. It's like, but I see the freedom in that, and I think that can influence and make more impactful work. Just sort of an honesty with what's the sort of foundation and then where it's going from there.
So I think one of the things that I've always observed in talking to you and getting to know your work is that there's this very clear core mission, which you touched on here, about this sense. Well, there are a number of things that describe it, but there's this real sense of kind of elevating the normal, or looking at youth culture and not just dictating to it, but sharing what your interests are, and then learning from
The
culture
feedback.
to sort of the feedback really has an impact on how you evolve your work. And I'm wondering, since so much of your work is collaborative, I'm wondering about, and sometimes with really big personalities, you've been very modest, but we could give a impressive celebrity list, right? How do you maintain your own definitions of integrity when you're working collaboratively and when you're working with these sort of entities in a sense? And so how is that feedback thing that's happening when your ideas are clarifying, how does that work in a collaboration when you're trying to maintain your own point of view?
Yeah, it's what's funny is like there must be like two types of creatives, ones that are better like off on their own, sort of like offering things. For me, I'm the opposite. I work with parameters. Like the confines actually make the design. Like that idea of a sweatshirt was made because I couldn't find a screen printer. I was already assumed in my head, but because I couldn't find that, I found this. So I'm sort of reactionary in that way. A large part of my work in a collaborative sense is it's in the same spirit. I learn more in a sort of feedback, or this I don't like, or finding a solution with a tougher sort of like construct than if it was less, if it was just my own voice. And I think I have like a natural sense to do a lot of projects at one time, but that process and that idea of one thing influencing another, maybe even in a different genre, makes all those expressions stronger.
So there's this clear sense of social engagement as a driver for you. There's also a sense of social innovation. You know, certainly the Art Basel installation and the sheetrock stacks for bases of furniture, and the sense of the political messaging in the chairs and also in the painting.
Yeah.
How much does social innovation serve as a kind of personal belief system in the work?
One that comes to mind, like working with Kanye, he had one time said something that's super profound and had an impact on me. Ever since then, he's like, yo, you realize that like if we work hard, we could actually like raise the taste level of a whole generation in society. You know, it's like if you sit and you're like, is this the best font on planet Earth for this exact thing? And then you wake up and then you throw it away and then you're like, is this better? Like the amount of influence that people have, like someone like himself, or it's not even a celebrity thing, it's just a person who is that influential, could all of a sudden actually change the world for a better place. I think that's to the core of why the work that we do in places like RISD or in design school, it's not just the practical. It's like tugging at our hearts to be invested in art and design. What I think the tremendous new point of freedom is that these things aren't trivial. They're not just things to put up on a wall anymore. They're not things for a higher society to use as like trophies for being rich. Like this water bottle gets sold in multiples that are probably insane. Can you imagine if this was designed by a RISD student, what it would look like versus where it came from? You know, not to say anything about its design, but imagine if young people got to design stuff like this. And that's what I want my work to sort of stand for and be sort of like a credible sort of bullet point. Is like, say when I did the LVMH prize, to me, the only way that I felt that I could do that and sort of bring myself and my friends to the table was to wear a Supreme shirt every day. And I was just running around there being like, yo, Supreme is my Louis Vuitton. And, you know, that was like 2 years ago. And while I was doing that, you know, it was insane because like your work is being judged by like every best living designer, you know, and sponsored by, you know, the world's most prestigious luxury fashion house. So it was a super honor to me to be a part of that. And the first person to sort of critique my work was Marc Jacobs. Just like, I was like, oh, that's cool. What's up? And he looked at my T-shirt and he was like, I immediately get it. He was like, that dot just got connected. He's like, so when a young kid in New York shows up to my office wearing a Supreme hat, he's like, I understand that you're coming from a different point of fashion design and culture, but me being there in that system and showing the work means that now that link is connected. You know, like this is a new format for fashion design. I've brought it to this juncture, and then now the establishment can like look down and understand its value and say, give a kid a shot that comes from a different niche culture that can influence design. So that, in a nutshell, is what I think is inspiring about this, where we're gonna go in the next 2, 3, 10 years.
So it's interesting that you kind of talk about it looking down as if there's this kind of platform of design, and you're bringing humility to it, which is something that I find so moving in a way, is that you're actually taking the kind of high commercial aspects of design, and you're bringing in this piece of it that's really about describing a better future in a very humble way, and that you're actually getting, the icons to respond to that.
That's, I simply, and that's like what before I was just designing things, I was like, here's another shirt, and then that's why I was just focused on that, and then the power of design is much bigger than that. And then I'm looking at me and my generation, how do we get to play in the place where we all get to do the things that are at the highest influence. And it's through doing good work, but also doing profound work. And so being a sort of translator between both those spheres, I think is important work to be done. Like it's easier to be a designer that doesn't do things exactly like this. That's kind of like the more artsy thing to do, is to say no to everything. But
Thankfully you didn't say no.
But like it's such a disservice to the whole room to not have these like things to think about as they're developing their own work, and to me it informs my work. My experience on campus today is going to inform my next, fashion collection, just by nature of saying yes to that. And I think it's just important that synergistically these moments happen between, industry and someone who's making things in different spaces to students who are still developing their identities.
So, we are a very global school. You are a very global designer, but on the national front, there's a lot of divisiveness going on in our country right now. So, there's a big debate about, are we entering the Dark Ages, or are we entering another age of enlightenment? And I wonder if you're talking about the opportunity of youth culture, of young designers, of new voices, of 2.0s, to actually have an impact on that. What do you think about that question of, darkness or enlightenment?
Yeah, I'm like perpetually optimistic by like DNA, so I'd be hard pressed to sort of like fall into a sort of like Debbie Downer type scenario. But it's a helpful tool to like also cope with a reality that doesn't seem as like bright. But my thing is simply in the creative field, like what's our collective response? I think that literally it becomes like a perfect time to sort of insert radical ideas. It's like, it's proof to the concept that radical ideas work if we collectively think that our circumstance on a global or national level is radical. Then what I would be more impressed by is if from the creative field, ideas were equally as radical and equally as optimistic, or in that same spirit, because from what I see, that should work as well. I have a belief that positive vibes rule the world. So like, I like little ideas that you see that resonate on like a tech front, like my mind is still blown by the idea of Uber and Postmates, that like we have these things in our phones that now we can like, or like say an Apple Watch, like you're wearing that technology on your wrist, and this is like the power of what's in your phone on your laptop, and it's able to integrate with your life. Like iterating on that, it seems like it can be a positive reaction to a sort of like political or socio vantage point that collectively we could agree is a little bit extreme.
Yeah, I think one of the worries that I have, in running a school that is really about the future, is the fact that it's very easy for my generation to say, you know, we messed it up, you guys fix it. And that's not a fair responsibility to put on the future. So I guess the question that I would ask you is how can we put prompts out there that creative people can use to awaken people's minds without putting the burden of that on their shoulders?
Yeah, I take that responsibility as like someone who is just by nature sort of in between both. You know, I add that DNA into my work. You know, there's ways to be provocative and like raise awareness with a certain sort of like tact and sort of true to my brand. But I think it's only going to be those nuances or things that are trend setting. You know, what I believe in our genre of like creativity, you know, what I do love about like Hype Beast as like its culture is like we can make trends happen. Like if we can make a print sell hundreds of units in record amounts of time, what happens if we use those same resources to providing fresh water for developing countries? And in my mind, as my career goes in the future, it's about sort of taking everything I've learned and sort of bending it towards like projects like, you know, I just made that up on the spot, but that seems interesting. You know, that seems like a new frontier after fashion is sort of just generally cool. Or, you know, I think that once the younger generation finds out that that's going to be uncharted territory in creativity, that's when I think we start seeing new, like the Enlightenment period, which I guess comes after a perceivably dark time.
So we're coming, sadly, near the end of our time, but and I want to have a chance for, we'll probably have time for just a couple questions, but it was interesting how you were talking earlier about sort of curating your experience on Instagram, you know, having that be a part of it, and that's partly how the message gets out there.
Yeah.
And so how do you find the right balance between the telling and the doing?
Yeah, I think I always rationalize like only like lightly referencing. There's so much doing that happens, and then there's not enough time to sort of like story tell around it. But I think the storytelling is important. I think that the power, it's a tool. You know, I think it's a tremendous new tool to communicate to large mass amounts of people that aren't controlled by a voice. It's not edited. And I think it's amazing that, you know, like say Travis Scott can have however many millions of followers and have that much reach and not be in between a magazine to like requote him, you know. And then now what you can have is you can have a generation who that's their icon, or it could be anyone. And now they're sort of directly in communication with that without a filter. That's, you know, I use mine for design and things that I'm into and sort of like phrasing it in a particular way. And so it's just as important as the work in a way. Like think about the amount of kids watching this live stream and that were notified by it through social media. And now they're getting all these, hopefully, good jewels of information that they can now apply to their own practice. You know, everyone in the world's at RISD today.
Yeah, exactly. Hi, world. So there's a bunch of stuff that you have coming up. You've got a new furniture collection. You've got a book coming out. Do you want to just give us one other hint of something new that's coming out so we can hear it here first?
Breaking news. I get in trouble when I do that, so I'm learning my lesson.
Okay.
I already talked too much about
Right,
the shoes.
we won't
so
put
I'm
you on the
screwed.
spot, but earlier, because we really do, unfortunately, need to close, and I want to honor your request that you had earlier about something that you want to get from this audience. So if you could just sort of restate what it is you're looking for one or two students to tell you about. So this is the research portion now of the lecture. You wanted to hear from one or two individuals about what is sort of prompting their drive, their thinking, their motivation right now. Is that
Exactly.
so we need two quick volunteers to tell us about what's, here's one, oh, you choose, yeah.
Over here.
Hi.
What up?
Thanks for coming to RISD. This was a super inspiring talk.
Thanks.
Especially what you were talking about things being unfinished.
Yeah.
Or like the idea of like taking from a field and like taking from like high art and then plugging it into culture. The way that you conceive of yourself as a maker is like very collaboratively rather than just like as an isolated maker. And I feel like what you were talking about, like being reactionary, is like a more realistic view of how we can actually create impacts with our design and artwork, because I feel like a lot of us, or the predominant like mindset of making right now is that we do have control of the resources, the materials that we have. We do have control over how it disseminates and how the audience perceives it. But what we don't actually realize is that there is most of the factors that we are doing is like out of our control in terms of like how it gets disseminated. Just for example, like in fashion, the use of it's created a lot of desirability for like high brands, but then one wouldn't anticipate the like proliferation of like counterfeit culture, and then or even like counterfeit culture pushed to the extreme.
So what's driving you? That's the question.
Okay, sorry, I'm like a bit rambling all over. I definitely resonate with what you're talking about, like design as a means of like facilitating different imaginations of social interaction, or just different ways of society organizing, like what you were talking about, like thinking about Uber as a like design prompt in the way that it organizes people and in the way that it distributes resources. And I feel like that's something that we're all really interested. But it was like what I meant with the like maker stuff, like people being like not conceiving yourself as like an individual maker, is also related to that, is because like by seeing that yourself existing in a network culture and having this responsibility to like have this like feedback loop, you're like taking on the, not to say the burden, but the responsibility of the designer to create a better world.
Yeah, I think, because what I'm interested, like when you guys are in your studios making stuff, are you sort of like, I'm just wondering, as like, do you think about it as like I'm trying to be an individual, or do you see yourselves as like, hey, our whole design studio is like iterating off each other and we're moving as a group towards an end goal? Like, do you look at your own work?
I mean, I definitely feel like I conceive myself making as like existing in a network, but I also feel like that's not a view that's like that's just starting to become.
Yeah, but what I think sort of as we're going through this here, I'm realizing one of the most powerful new tools in creativity and design is to sort of like not take the sort of the DNA of what previous generations were and carry that through. I'm just kind of like, hey, I've seen something over the hill.
Right.
Is that every older sort of gatekeeper that you'll come across in every industry that you want to do, whether it be working at a fashion house or try to get hired here, that previous generation was cemented by certain facts. Right. One of those things were like, don't give the kids the information, don't let them into that luxury store. Hey, this is high art, you know, this is for you guys, do that, this is that. And one of the bullet points of this modern culture is like information is free. So how should that affect your practice? How should that affect your personal work?
Yeah, and I think one of the challenges, we need to move on. Thank you.
Wait, could I just say one last thing?
No, well, I think we got to move on. Can give someone else a chance. But what I was going to say is that I think it's curiosity more than whether it's individual or collective. I think there's just sort of something that is curious, and with every decade, what becomes curious changes. And if you think about, you said information is so available, it's accessible, but it also makes it harder to be genuinely curious because it's all out there.
Yeah, and that's where we get with like, oh, you're a cooler artist or designer if you like a recluse and give no information. Like, I don't know. I'm just sort of kicking the tires at all that. In every instance where I've seen access given to someone that's like not the obvious choice in terms of like, hey, you get to design the water bottle. I've seen it resonate with a positive reaction, with like allowing new types of designers into the conversation that have been traditionally making X, Y, Z.
No, that's great. So over here, is there one more person that you choose, Virgil, that wants to tell what's motivating your work right now, and then we got to end.
The girl in the back. It's always whoever like has like the highest or the most eager. That's. But I'll be around, kick it, talk it to everyone.
Wow, thank you for picking me. Yeah, so I think like one of the most impactful things that you said was not denying that you've been influenced, or that we like exist within this world of constantly seeing things, and like you're not in a bubble or coming up with things originally. And I think I'm in the sophomore painting studio right now, and we don't have walls between our studio spaces. And it's this really crazy thing because you walk back into studio and you see something over there that you thought was yours, but then someone else is doing it. Or, but then you also look at your own painting and you're like, oh my gosh, that line work is totally from like that girl over there. Like, do I hide it now? Or like, and I think one of the best things about being in that studio space is you can kind of like shamelessly like try out these new things. And like, you can't, like none of us can stop this like perpetual sharing of our work and the visual language. And our professor was talking during Crit the other day, and he was like, it's kind of hard to teach now because there's not, like in this classroom, there's not like, I'm going to tell you to do this, and this is how you're going to do it. Like in art now, it's like, anything can be defined and presented. And so I think that's like one of the things is you talk a lot about hard work, and that's like one of the things is like finding refuge in making, and this like perpetual like acceptance that you're going to be influenced, but if you continue to work for it, you'll develop like a voice within that, and kind of like taking this collection of things with you that starts to travel into your own narrative, but like continues to change.
Yeah. One thing that, like hearing your impressions and then sort of like revalidating thoughts that I have in my head too. I'm fortunate enough to have Peter Saville, who's a artist. I asked him because because I've been doing this for a little while of like making a T-shirt graphic style, putting it out there, and then it like resonates, and then hey, it's basically I'm a group chat with a bunch of my guy friends, and we have like these inside jokes, and those things turn into a brand, or they turn into it's artwork in quotes. It's like it's not artwork, like from a crafted skill person, but it put out into the public, it resonates and it influences. So the underlying thing is it's ironic. And I asked Peter Saville, who's 30 years older than me, as like a design mentor, is like, hey, help me through this because I'm starting to feel cheap. The irony is our generation's humor. Like it's young people, the way they communicate. Like it's got to be almost one of the hardest things for an older generation to actually understand the dialogue between all these young kids. It's like irony, like I wear this to be ironic, or I make this meme because it's ironic humor, and that's like when you get into like postmodern. The idea is that this is the generational context. These are how we're making art. Like your studio is an exact example of what happens when we're all on Instagram all day. We're influenced. I think there's a tremendous freedom once the creative field and industry sort of accepts that this is the common, this is the way artists are influenced. They're looking at other things. They're seeing the highest, most amount of photos get taken of this sculpture. Every other artist is seeing it. You're either admitting to see it, and then you're making work, either in reaction or to sort of support a new idea. And that's where, in 10 years, we're only going to be influenced by more and more things if this is our way of communicating.
So I'll just end with one thing, talking about this notion that you brought up and that you're echoing about commitment and discipline. And I just want to read you what was in my fortune cookie recently at a restaurant, which was, this was the best fortune I ever got, I think, other than one that said disregard all previous fortunes.
Wow.
Discipline is the refining fire by which talent becomes ability. So I'll just end on that.
That's good. Did you save it?
I did. All right, well, thank you all so much. And Virgil, thank you. It's been great.
Thank you.